This is the flag of the country of Australia. And this is a brief video about a magnificent experience that I had with my family when we moved to the Outback of Australia to raise cotton, of all things. How in the world did that happen? Well, we were living in California, and I was employed as a contract administrator in the legal department of Aerojet General Corporation, which at the time was a solid rocket plant. It's closed now, of course, in Folsom, California. My duties included overseeing a team of engineers and architects and accountants, everybody involved in building solid rockets for the NASA and the Navy and the Air Force. My job was to ensure that those products were delivered on time, the products being ICBMs and Sergeant missiles and all that dangerous stuff, on time and within budget. One of the engineers on our team, his name was Bill Head, he claimed he knew something about growing cotton, and he learned of an opportunity in Australia. So he and two others in this group that I was with pooled their funds, and they formed a thing called the Southern Cross Cotton Company. They needed more capital to send Bill Head to Australia so he could procure one of the tracts of land and grow a crop of cotton. I was convinced that it was a great opportunity, so I invested. Several months later, after receiving reports and photos of the crops he was supposed to be nurturing and we were supposed to be profiting from, they were in miserable shape. The reports weren't correct. I couldn't understand how the logic, all those things were written down. They just didn't make sense. The pictures of the plants were pathetic. So I suspected conditions weren't quite as they were supposed to be. So I made a quick trip to Australia to see for myself, and I was shocked at what I found. I could see, however, an opportunity. This is a map of Australia. As you can see, it's comprised of 6 states plus the island of Tasmania. And this next shot here, now this is going to be a little bit erratic because I'm trying to work both the sound and trying to coordinate the slides at the same time, and they don't last very long. But what you see here is a picture of me, and this is why I went there. You can see the cotton there that's starting to grow and so on the plants. And this is really another shot of what we went there for, what I originally invested. But anyway, I ended up purchasing land on our own. So now let's get on with it. Here's this is a shot from the airplane that when I first arrived. You'll notice the dark spot there, one in the foreground and one in the background. The one in the background is one we need to focus on because that's the land that I took took over ownership of, that particular one, and that which we land. Now, why in this particular spot of Australia was this particular project? Well, this project was established by the Australian government. I'm going to stop the pictures here just for a second. The Australian government decided that they needed to quit importing so much cotton and grow some cotton domestically in their own country to make a better job of the balance of payments, so to speak. So anyway, they opened up this particular plot of land. Why this particular plot of land? Because it is 125 miles south of the Tropic of Capricorn, just as Bakersfield, California is 125 or so miles north of the Tropic of Cancer. Consequently, the climate was the same, very much so. And Bakersfield, they tried to emulate Bakersfield because it happens to be the greatest cotton growing area in the country. I know a lot of people in the South will object to that, but by that I mean at that time, the amount of yield, the number of bales of cotton per acre, well, it was the greatest in Bakersfield of any other place in the nation. So Australians tried to emulate that, and that's why they settled on that particular spot in St. George, of the town of St. George in the state of Queensland, which is 400 miles or so due west of the east coast of Brisbane. Yes, I didn't say Brisbane, I said Brisbane. That is correct. Now, what they did, going back to that previous picture, you saw a dam with some water. They then dug a channel, and it's about 15 feet across, 6 feet or so deep, the one that you're looking at right now. And it was dug for 10 miles from the dam. They called it a weir in Australia, but it's a dam, as far as I'm concerned, and you too probably. They dug a ditch, this gigantic ditch, for 10 miles. Okay, let's move the slides here a little bit farther. There we go. And this is the kind of land that we found when we got out there, when we discovered what was going on and found all the land. This is the land that was available to us. This is the shape it was in. Notice there's some native grasses, some trees, not a whole lot. And our job was to clear the land. Well, in some cases, we just merely had to come in and knock the trees over, like we did, as you see right here. Some of these trees, of course, were dead already. You can see that. We had to pull them aside. And in some cases, we had to notice these are dead. And here's a shot here. This particular one shows you we had to burn off a lot of the area. So we either had to burn it off, knock the trees down, use a bulldozer, which you'll see coming up right here. And yes, that is yours truly on the bulldozer, knocking this tree over. So we had to knock it over or use dynamite to blow it out. That's a story all to itself. And then the water that you just saw a moment ago, the water that was piped out, I should say trenched out with that gigantic trench for 10 miles, when it reached the edge of the farm, your particular farm, they had a wheel, just like you see right here. And this wheel turns, and it measures the amount of acre feet of water that you will consume, and it goes in a conduit under the road. And you'll see on the upper right-hand side of the picture, you'll see a ditch. Well, of course, this is way ahead of the game, but this shows you how the water was delivered to the property. Okay, moving on. The ditch that you see there in the upper right-hand corner, that's what you're looking for. And sometimes it was quite a job to get the water there. Let me move the slide on a little bit more here. Okay. Now, then when the water got to your side of the street, then we took 55-gallon barrels and cut the ends of them out, and built a little dam, so to speak, with a couple of boards and so forth, and we were able to allow the water to flow on to the ditch. Keep in mind now, they delivered the water to the property edge, and it was our responsibility and our ingenuity to find a way to get the water onto our own particular property, the 690 acres that I told you about. Okay, so here's the ditch. Water's coming in, and all righty, let's see sometimes there's a crawler. We were digging out one of the ditches, and it looks like this crawler ran into some trouble. Fortunately, it didn't capsize. Listen to me. Didn't turn over, but it was in pretty bad shape. Okay, so we now have a ditch, and we have the land cleared. We've knocked the trees over. We burned it off. We got bare land in this particular case, so it was in pretty good shape to start with. But remember, there has never, ever been any other person other than God, and of course God's not a person. We know that. I was the very first individual to to plow this land and plant seed, other than God putting weed seeds out there for a bazillion years until I arrived. And there's a picture of my tractor, and I can tell you right now that the very first day that I was there on the tractor plowing, and I plowed up, an acre or two, and then I stopped the tractor, put it in neutral, spun around in my seat, and looked back, and I said, you know what? I did that. I'm the very first person to plow this land and will be the first person to plant any kind of seed in it. That was pretty doggone good feeling, I can tell you that right now. So, okay, moving on. After I did a lot of plowing and disking and leveling and so forth, then we brought the tractors out. This particular tractor is hooked as an Alice Chalmers. It's hooked up to a 4-row John Deere planter, and we've got cottonseed and fertilizer in that particular planter. And by the way, that particular tractor also converts into a cotton picker, as you will see in just a little while. Moving on, here's a shot of the rows that were planted. And those, notice in the distance, first of all, in the foreground, that's Ted Hintz, Hintz, a wonderful man, the local Australian guy. He was the only individual that we hired. He worked for us. That was all. So with this whole project, 500 acres that we put under production in 2 years' time, out of the 690, 200 acres of cotton, and some alfalfa, which you'll see here in a few minutes, and so on. Ted Hintz, he was the only employee that we had. These rows are 2,200 feet long, and the water was dumped from that ditch that you saw a few minutes ago, and they're all sloped properly. So you dump the water on the high end, and Ted was out there with his hoe making sure that the water was channeled into every one of the rows, into one of the furrows, as it's called in the agricultural world, into every one of the furrows, and the soil was such that it would permeate through the dirt itself, right into the row where it hit the seed and moistened the seed, and then, of course, with the temperature, which is probably 89, 90 degrees, maybe 100 degrees, but the humidity was very low. Consequently, it grew very, very well. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. The planters, of course, they've grown up quite a bit. There's a picture of me spraying. We had a tremendous problem with insects. Then we had to cultivate. Then we also had to spray some more. And once in a while, if we ran into trouble, here's a problem with this John Deere tractor. Apparently, I don't know what the problem was. Flat tire, whatever the case may be, but we, needless to say, we had a problem. And keep in mind that the only individual that had any kind of a workshop at all was 10 miles away in town, and the John Deere dealer was about 380 miles away in Brisbane. So you learned how to do a bunch of stuff you never knew before, like weld. Can you imagine me, those of you who know me, that I learned how to weld? I had to. Either that or I couldn't survive doing what I was doing with a broken whatever. Moving on. Okay, now, once we got the plants, got to the point where you could not get a tractor in because they were too tall, we then employed this spray plane. We actually owned that airplane. That is a Gypsy Tiger Moth DH-82. It is all fabric. Notice on the wings, the lower wings, you notice the nozzles. The nozzles would spray 4 rows onto each side of the cockpit. It was a twin cockpit airplane. The front cockpit was everything was taken out of it, all the instrumentation, the seats and everything. It was fiberglassed in, and that was a tank. And we dumped insecticide in that tank. Pilot would I didn't fly this one. I flew on one exactly like this, just different color. on a flying club that I belonged to when I was there, and I flew that. It was a lot. It was a lot of fun. I didn't fly this one. I was too happily married. Anyway, so this young Australian pilot, very, very great, daredevil pilot, he would fly this airplane. And by the way, for those of you who know anything about flying, look at the top of the wings. You will see a tank up there. That's the fuel tank. And with a hose that goes from the fuel tank down into the engine had no fuel pump. Consequently, you could only be inverted if you're doing it was aerobatic, and you could only do aerobatics maybe for a short period of time, maybe a minute. That's about all. And otherwise, you better invert back up again, or else you're going to run out of fuel. So anyway, that's how we sprayed our cotton after we couldn't get in with the tractors. So that's a DH-82 Dixie Gypsy Tiger Moth. And here's a picture again. Why we went to Australia is to do this, is to come up with this stuff. Yeah, there it is right there. This is a shot of me on a John Deere cotton picker. The cotton would be grasped, if you will, by some barbs on the inside of that machinery. There'd be a big vacuum cleaner, and that tube up behind me would suck it up into, and there you see the cotton into that basket. I wasn't particularly wild about that cotton picker, but there was another one that I did like a lot better, and that's this one here. This is the tractor that you saw earlier that was hooked up to, that had the planters hooked on. And you hook the picking machinery onto this particular tractor, and then you convert it. All of a sudden, it becomes from a tractor into a cotton picker. And here's a picture with me dumping a load. There's about 1,000 pounds of cotton each time into this flatbed. It's just an old flatbed truck with a bunch of tarp around the sides of it, so the cotton won't blow out. And here's an interesting little insight. When I paid not by the weight but by the trip, so the more cotton I could jam into that 18-wheeler, the better off I was. So my two little children at the time, Sharon, my daughter, and Craig, my son, they were what we call cotton stumpers. They were, I don't know, it was like 5 years old and seven or 8 years old at the time, something like that. And maybe it's being mean to children, but they enjoyed it. So I would dump the cotton in it, and after about 5 dumps or so, they would get inside into that 18-wheeler and just walk around, stomp, walk around to pound it down. And if we didn't pound it down, we'd get about 10 dumps into the back of that trailer. But if they walked around on it, we could get 20 dumps in it. So as I said earlier, it was beneficial to do that simply because we paid by the trip as opposed to the load. So anyway, we got so far, we're pretty close to the end of the trail here. And then after it got loaded, after it was loaded up, the trucker would come and hook up to it and haul it off to Sydney. You'll see another one. That's an empty one waiting to be loaded. So we just and by the way, once cotton picking season started, you didn't stop. It was 24 hours a day, night and day, until you got it all picked, simply because at the time, they may have today, but at the time, if a storm came through and blew the cotton off the plant onto the ground, it was a dead loss. There was no way you could pick the cotton up and retrieve it. They may have machinery today, but back then they didn't. They didn't. It was a total loss. And furthermore, even if it was retrieved, it would be different. It would be soiled and so forth. And the magic number that we were looking for was fair to middling, 1.5 quarter-inch staple length. That was it. 1/4 inch staple length and fair to middling. That means it's, as it says, the staple of when you pull it apart, the cotton, it would be 1.25 inches long, each of the strands. That would be perfect. and it would be fair to middle, which meant it was doggone nice and beautiful white. That's what they were looking for. Okay, when the cotton season was over, or actually commensurate with that, but at other times we also grew alfalfa. We had 40 acres of alfalfa, and here you see it in windrows. Alfalfa at the time was extremely valuable because we had irrigation, and a lot of my neighbors grew sheep. They didn't have irrigation, so they had sheep that were starving, and so I provided them, not provided, but sold them at a reasonable price, obviously. I sold them some alfalfa so they could keep their sheep going. And here's a picture of my neighbor, Don. I did not own that particular harvester there, that windrower, as we call it. That's that particular. We had a great little community there, and neighbors couldn't afford to own all the equipment that they needed to do everything. So I'd buy one piece of machinery, and he'd buy another, and then we'd trade off. He'd cut my hay, and I'd cut his cotton or harvest that sort of stuff. You know what I'm saying. Anyway, so that was we're growing alfalfa in addition to the cotton. And here you see the bales of alfalfa lined up. And here's another crop. I was the first in the area to do that. This was called Sudax. It's been some time now. I don't even remember what it was a hybrid, some kind, but it was sold again to the sheep farmers because they sheep ranches. You see how tall it is. We would cut it. Since it was so tall and green and juicy, you couldn't bale it right away. You had to wait for quite a few days in the sun for it to dry out. Otherwise, it would mildew and rot, and sometimes internal combustion and so forth. Anyway, not internal combustion. You know what I'm talking about. How about spontaneous combustion? Does that work? That's better. Okay. There you see my son Craig, 5 years old. Goes to show you how tall that Sudax was. It made great hay. Here's another shot of this is my pickup truck in Australia. It's not a pick, it's a ute, U-T-E, which is short for utility. They don't have pickup trucks there. That's not a pickup, that's a ute. As far as I'm concerned, it was a pickup. But anyway, so much for that. Here's an extraneous shot. This is an emu. You know, Liberty, I shouldn't give them any credit, but the thing that's on that insurance company, they have an emu on it. Well, that's what it is right there. I had to deal with those things practically on a daily basis. Wild ones would come into the farm, and they have gigantic feet, and they would stomp all over the young plants and pull the plants out of the ground, and I had a field day with my shotgun. Moving on, here's a bunch of sheep. I did not own a single sheep except those that I slaughtered. Had my buddy, my employee, Ted Hintz, butcher for us, which we had, I guarantee you, we had more sheep or mutton to eat than I had in all my life while I was there, simply because there was a shortage of beef and chicken. And but anyway, these are sheep that I just leased this particular harvest. As you can see, all the hay is gone, and we harvested the hay, but there's still some stubble left, so I leased that particular property for the neighbor, for he could come and graze his sheep. Moving on. There's Ted, bad shot, but there's a picture of sheep from these are 60. I also had 60 head of shorthorn cattle, which was really my first love, cattle and horses. And this is and Ted, my faithful guy. There he is on a horse, driving the some of the shorthorn cattle down the highway. From one pasture to another. Now, and this shot here, this is the main highway. It's basically one car a little more than one car wide. It is not wide enough for two cars. So if you're heading into town or you're heading out of town to go to Brisbane, 300 miles away, that's the road right there. Get on it and go. And if you a car approaching from the opposite direction, we all know in Australia, which by the way you just drive on the other side of the road. That was quite an experience for me to switch immediately. And so you just pull off. Two of your wheels are on the shoulder, and two of the wheels on the road until you zoom by each other, and then you go back on the road again. I left this shot for the very end of this particular little ditty here that I'm doing. This is one of our employees that we had him just seasonally when we had a heavy load of work to do, and we needed somebody to help out additionally. And he's 16 years old, dropped out of school, which so many of the kids then did years ago, back in those days. And he is boiling his billy. You can't see it, but he's got a little tin can with a handle. It's about the size of a fruit cocktail can. And he drilled two little holes in the side, put a little handle on it, put some water in it, and put it over a little fire that he made. Now, keep in mind, then he would bring with him in his lunchbox, which is called a tucker box, he would bring a jar, and in the jar would be a handful of sugar and a handful of tea. And then the water would boil. He'd dump the tea into that mixture into the can, and it would steep for a while, and then he would use that to drink his tea with. So he'd have hot tea. When if you look to the left, you'll see my daughter Sharon. When it's time for take a break, she didn't have to worry about gathering up a bunch of firewood, making a fire, and boiling tea. All she did is you can see her leaning against that back of that pickup truck, and behind her is a little cooler, and it's got iced tea in the thing. So anyway, that's it's a religious custom that they have. That's what they do. When they have their break, they have a tucker box, and they boil their billy. As I make a few closing remarks, here's a quick glimpse of the house we lived in St. George, in town. We didn't live on the farm, but in town, about 10 miles away. The school my children went to, and the church we attended. Migrating to the outback of Australia was a major adjustment in itself. Overcoming the obstacles of raising cotton, which I had never done before, on virgin land which had never been farmed before with any crop, was very challenging, to say the least. The parcel of land we acquired was 690 acres, and in 2 years' time, believe it or not, we put 500 acres under cultivation. And you saw some of the pictures as to what we had to do in order to make it appropriate and ready for cultivation. It was a family effort. My wife, Betty, daughter, Sharon, and son, Craig, whom you saw a few minutes ago, plus one full-time hired hand, Ted Hintz. It was hard work, but very satisfying and rewarding. We had some very interesting and exciting experiences living in the Australian outback. It's a great country. I enjoy talking about it. If you'd like more detail, contact me.